Dave, if I would have a psychological wish, it would be that materialism isn't true. I was trained as a brain scientist. Many of my friends are scientists, so I have a feeling that, it probably is. Consciousness enters the scene and changes the dynamics. How are the different ways that we can understand consciousness?
Well, I was trained as a scientist. My attitude was that materialism had to be true. And there was just this little problem reconciling materialism with consciousness. And only over time have I begun to think this is more and more of a problem. And in fact, maybe it's impossible to reconcile consciousness with materialism. But the basic views that one might take on this thing include materialism, the thesis that everything is ultimately physical, including consciousness. Dualism, the thesis there's two fundamentally different kinds of things, matter and consciousness. And to make the group complete, idealism, the view that all there is in the world is consciousness and matter is just derivative on that.
Okay, so let's take each of these categories and maybe dissect them down to where philosophers have thought deeply about it. Because most people think that it's either consciousness or God. I mean, that's the story. But there are some subtle differences here. Let's start with materialism. You've articulated three subdivisions that you can think about materialism in. What are they?
Well, the basic problem for materialism about consciousness is something like this. You could know all about the physical processes in the world, in the brain, and not know about consciousness. Somebody could know about every last neuron in the brain involved in, say, color processing. They wouldn't know about the experience. That wouldn't tell them about the experience of seeing red. So what's a materialist to do about that? Prima facie, something's been left out of the material story. So three different attitudes I can take. First attitude, the one I call the type A attitude, is just to take the hard line, deny consciousness. There's just nothing here that needs explaining. There's not really a phenomenon of consciousness at all. You explain everything there is to say about the brain, end of story.
And you call that eliminativism because you eliminate it.
Yeah. Basically, you say there's nothing else here to explain about what there is in the brain. Who cares about consciousness?
And there was a long tradition in that. So behaviorism, in one sense, ignored consciousness, and many well-known philosophers would take that view that we think we are conscious, but we're really not. It is an illusion.
Some people, behaviorists ignore consciousness, saying, well, that's not my problem. But the harder line is to deny consciousness and say, in fact, there's no such thing. It's an illusion. I find that view impossible to believe myself because I take consciousness to be a fundamental datum of our existence.
Okay, so that's type A.
Yeah.
So that's the first one. Second one.
Type B materialism, I guess, is the one that says, okay, there is this phenomenon of consciousness, and there is a gap between our knowledge of the brain and our knowledge of consciousness, maybe even a fundamental gap. But that's only really a conceptual gap. It's a gap in knowledge of a level of thought. So knowledge of the brain will never produce knowledge of consciousness. But they say, in nature, consciousness and the brain are one and the same thing. So there's no gap at the level of existence. There's just two ways that we come to know about this thing. From the outside, you look at a brain and you see a brain. From the inside, you think about a brain and it seems to you like consciousness. But it's just one thing in nature. That's a very attractive view in many ways. Unfortunately, I think it can't work, but a very attractive view.
So there's a gap in knowledge, but in principle, there's no gap in substance or being or ontology, we call it. So there's no real difference, but there is this knowledge difference.
On this view, there's two basic kinds of concepts. There's physical concepts, when we look at physical processes from the outside, and there's mental concepts, when we look at these processes from the inside. These are two different ways of thinking. But on this view, they're two different ways of thinking about one underlying reality. Physical processes and consciousness are one and the same thing.
Good. So it's still it is materialistic because consciousness is not a real independent thing, even though they seem to be.
Exactly. One phenomenon in the world, two means of access to it.
Okay. Third approach to materialism.
So another view is that there is a gap between physical processes and consciousness in our current theories. That right now, thinking about the physical processes won't tell us about consciousness. But that's a gap that could be closed in the limit. It's that right now, we're not smart enough to figure out the connection between brain processes and consciousness. But if we do enough more science and enough more philosophy, perhaps in the ideal limit, we'll be able to deduce the whole story about consciousness from the physical story. So maybe once Laplace's demon knows all about the brain and all about the interactions of the neurons, he'll then be able to figure out everything there is to know about the experience of consciousness. It's just that we're not there yet.
And that would be a view of most neuroscientists, I would think.
Look,
that given enough time and the progress that we've had, we eventually can go from the neural correlates of consciousness to the neural causes of consciousness. Fundamental difference now, but we can progress towards it.
I think this is probably the view of the average agnostic in the street about this question. We haven't figured out consciousness yet. Neuroscience can't do it yet, but somewhere down the line, we're going to get there. Now, my own view is there's a principled gap here. Because neuroscience is just going to give us more. Neuroscience gives us structure of the brain and dynamics of what we do. And that's all it's ever going to give us. More and more structure, more and more dynamics, more and more behavior. And that's always going to leave, in principle, a gap to consciousness. But this other view, the agnostic view, basically says that, well, somewhere along the line, we're going to figure out how to cross that gap.
An argument can be made that the approach you're taking is a linear one, and maybe there's some nonlinear dynamics. Best example is an atomic bomb. You have 1.9 kilograms of your U-235 or whatever the number is, and it's radioactive, and you shouldn't touch it or get near it, but it's inert. And you add another ounce or whatever, and you have an atomic bomb. So you have a critical mass at some point. There's no difference. There's no consciousness there, no non-physical stuff, but you have a vastly different experience.
It's very tempting and seductive, I think, to think that the key to consciousness is going to lie in something like chaos theory, nonlinear dynamics. Who would ever guess that the motion of a hurricane would emerge from simple principles of airflow? But what you find in all those other cases, like the hurricane and the water wave and so on, is complicated dynamics emerging from simple dynamics, complicated structures emerging from simple structures, new and surprising structures. With consciousness, we find something fundamentally new, not just more complex structures, not just more complex dynamics and functions, but a whole new kind of thing, subjective experience. And I think it's the kind of thing which in principle, just explaining structures and functions won't explain. So that's why I think there's a difference in principle here.
Subjective experience is a different kind of new thing than an atomic bomb is a different kind of new thing?
Different kind, more radically new thing, more radically different in kind. You can explain all the behavior, all the structure, all the function you like in the vicinity of consciousness, the things I do, the things I say, the amazing dynamics of the human brain. And it will still leave this further open question. Why is all that accompanied by first-person subjective experience of the mind and the world?
Okay, you got me fascinated because you now have three kinds of materialism and you've rejected all three. So I want to see what's left. You got a couple kinds of dualism and go for it.
So once you reject materialism, I think what you basically have to do is admit consciousness as a fundamental category of the world, perhaps alongside physical categories like space and time and mass. Then the basic question is, where on earth does consciousness fit in? We have this beautiful closed system of physics, space, time, mass, all seems to fit together seamlessly. Where is there room for consciousness? So here I think we have three different views for where consciousness might fit in. The first view is a view where consciousness lies outside physical processes completely and doesn't affect physical processes. So the brain and physical processes cause consciousness, but consciousness doesn't affect the brain. So consciousness dangles outside the system. Some people call it an epiphenomenon. So this leaves physics completely closed, coherent, autonomous in its own right. Consciousness exists as something separate, maybe affected by the physical, but it doesn't make a difference.
So in a sense, causation is one way.
Causation
it's
is
a one-way street.
Exactly. One-way street from physics to consciousness. That means physics can go just fine. Strangely, though, consciousness, on this view, is impotent
Yeah.
Everything I ever think and feel and so on in my consciousness never has any direct impact on my behavior.
So consciousness is real, but what's an illusion is that you think in your consciousness that you're having an effect on what you're doing, but
Exactly.
you're not. Is that right?
Exactly. And a lot of people find that hard to stomach, the idea that consciousness makes no difference. Because it sure seems to us all the time that I think and feel something, the fire hurts, I take my hand away from the flame.
But if it didn't hurt and you had no awareness, you would have still taken your hand away, because that's all determined
by the physical processes.
By physical process. Yeah. But that does protect the closed system of the physical world, that there's no artificial intervention by something new.
Right. We take consciousness out of the loop in order that physics can say master of its own domain, so to speak.
Okay. Okay. What's the other alternative?
Okay, so the next most radical form of dualism is that consciousness exists and is fundamental, separate from the physical world, but it has an effect on the physical world. It actually has a causal impact on the physical world. So physics affects consciousness one way, but here it's a two-way street. Consciousness comes back and affects physical processes. It makes particles move, let's say, in ways they wouldn't have moved unless consciousness had affected them.
Physicists and neuroscientists go crazy over this, because now you're violating some of the fundamental seeming principles of the physical world, and that is physics is now not a closed system, that you don't have conservation of energy and matter, and you've disturbed all of the fundamental laws of physics. You like doing that?
This is a much more radical view, so I think we shouldn't go here easily. We should be very, very cautious, because you might think science has taught us that physics is a closed system, that the brain is a closed system. There's one route here, though, that I think might be worth pursuing. And it's a hole that's left open, a loophole that's left open for where consciousness can have some impact. And that's in quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, we have the wave function, which evolves most of the time according to this nice Schrödinger equation. It goes along, but every now and then something strange happens. It collapses. Why does the wave function collapse? Quantum mechanics doesn't tell us. It just says it collapses when a measurement occurs. What's a measurement? No one knows. One of the big problems of quantum mechanics. But on the face of it, what looks like a measurement is measurement by a conscious observer. So you might think, boy, well, here is a point where if you wanted consciousness to make a difference to physics, it looks like the physics could not be designed more perfectly than for consciousness to play a role here. You look at the equations of physics. It leaves a perfect loophole right here for consciousness to have its impact on collapsing the wave function.
Now, a lot of quantum physicists would reject that as a simplistic view of consciousness, not a real deep understanding of consciousness, and call it amateurs dealing with quantum physics. So there's a lot of problems with that as well. But here you have consciousness being real in this two-way street.